Good afternoon and welcome to the February 18th work session of the Arlington County Board. We are all assembled. We have Vice Chair Crystal, Board Member Garvey, Board Member Carantonis, Board Member Dorsey, and we will shortly get it to the manager. I did want to note as we take up our budget this afternoon and get an overview of the manager's proposed budget, that it comes in the context of COVID, and we're continuing to do that work. We had a work session on vaccines on Tuesday, and I feel like as we're in the middle of February with some cold weather, a little good news. Our test positivity rate is down to 4.6%, which is, if you compare that with 3 weeks ago, is less than half. And we are working hard to get a vaccine out and working hard on many fronts while still continuing the budget work that is essential. So with that preamble, over to Manager Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Just a brief update for you on vaccines. As you all know, we canceled the vaccine clinics for today. We are fully open and go for tomorrow. We've already checked on that and made sure we've treated the sidewalks and roads to make sure that can happen. And we will have a very active Saturday and Sunday set of schedules. Next week, we're looking to see there have been some delivery issues across the country with some of the vaccine due to the weather, but people might get a little anxious about why there haven't been appointments opened up for sign up for the beginning of next week, and that is the reason. We have every expectation, though, that we will figure that out and let everybody know as soon as we can. So thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. I'm here to talk about the fiscal 2022 budget. And it seems like it was only a year ago that I was here presenting the fiscal 21 budget. Remember, the fiscal 21 budget went through at least 2 major revisions and several minor revisions. This budget for fiscal 22, it is my hope that this budget will bridge us from where we are now to a situation where we're in a more of a post-pandemic world. Given that, we have a situation right now where we need to be flexible and adaptable. We'll talk a little bit later. We have built a budget that I think is good for the circumstances, but again, may change. So you'll see here that the main priority of my budget is going to be to get us through the pandemic. And we can do that and at the same time continue to invest in those priorities that the board laid out in budget guidance. And you will see that in order to do that, we've adopted, I've proposed a budget that has a mix of cuts and also reliance on some one-time revenues. Now, with that comes an assumption that by fiscal 23, we hope to be in a better position. So we will talk a little bit about that. My budget proposal to you is to keep the real estate tax rate constant. That's at the $1 and 1.3 cents. You can see that there on the next to last bullet. Separately, given the bond issue approved by the voters in the fall and consistent with the commitment I made to you and that you made to the community to do investments in our stormwater infrastructure, I'm asking for a slight increase from 1.3 cents to 1.7 cents in the tax rate associated with stormwater. We'll have more on that as we go through the presentation. You will see for fiscal 22, the budget, our revenue changes. The amount of revenue we received in fiscal 22 as compared to fiscal 21 has increased by 0.1%. Now, we were absolutely lucky to have a tax increase based on assessments. Our real estate assessments, our residential sector has done quite well. You'll see a 5.6% increase. I know a lot of people received their real estate assessment notices in January. The commercial sector, not surprisingly, has been challenged, mainly the hotel portion of that sector, and there's been a drop in commercial assessments, but overall a 2.2% increase in revenue. You'll see the main impact in our revenue has been on consumption taxes. You can see that our hotel revenue has dropped close to 50%, from 19.3 million last year to an assumption of 10 million this year. Our meals tax is down about $5 million. And you'll see the sales tax is actually up a bit. Our non-tax revenue, parking meters, for example, are down about 1.5 million. Revenue from our ART transit system is down close to 2 million. And we've seen a slight reduction in some site plan submissions and other revenues that we would normally rely on. So you can see the overall picture is relatively surprisingly good on the real estate assessment side. But again, those consumption taxes, which are very sensitive to what's going on with the pandemic, are down. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, because there's been a lot of conversation about the package that's been proposed by President Biden, that $1.9 trillion package. The budget that I have proposed assumes no additional funds from the federal government. However, the House of Representatives is currently considering a package that includes amounts for state and local aid between $300 and $400 billion, of which it's estimated, according to the funding formulas, Arlington could receive that $46 million number there on the slide. And Arlington Public Schools could get close to $20.5 million. I mention that because I wanted people to keep that in mind. Again, consistent with what I said at the very beginning of the presentation, things will change. I am hoping, and I really am very, very optimistic that the Congress will recognize the financial stress we are under, as well as our sister jurisdictions, and that hopefully we'll be able to gain this additional funding. You may all recall that we received a similar amount under the CARES Act that has enabled us in this current fiscal year to keep a lot of our services going. So more to come on that. It's my expectation that while you're considering the budget, we start today and we end in April, that sometime in March there will be a final assessment of where that lands. Now, when the bill gets to the Senate, that's a little bit dicier. We'll see what happens, but wanted to provide that information. Go on. So by the numbers, our total budget, $1.36 billion. You can see that's a 1.4% increase based on the overall revenue increase. For county operating, you see there's a 1.6% increase, and for schools, a 1% increase. The difference there relies on the fact that the schools get 47% of tax revenue, and the county keeps 53% of tax revenue under the revenue sharing principles. And given that we will be receiving some additional one-time dollars related to lease renegotiations that's not shared with the schools, we have the benefit of that additional one-time money to help with some programs that I will lay out a little bit later in the presentation. So let's go on to the next slide. And I just want, within that $529.7 million, people often ask, what is it that we do for schools? And so in addition to that revenue, there's about $15 million in county services that we're going to provide as part of our proposed budget above and beyond the $530 million. And I think members of the board will be familiar with this slide, but you can see there are programs in parks. We help with school nurses. We're going to be adding a school nurse to our budget for the opening of the Reed School. We have a number of childhood programs. We have between $2 and $3 million related to school resource officers that we provide to schools. I know they're currently considering whether they want to continue that program, and another number of pieces of assistance we provide. And I'm sure we'll spend a lot more time talking about that during many of the upcoming work sessions. So let me go back to where I started, which was talking about this being a bridge year, and the number one priority that you laid out for me in budget guidance was to focus on the pandemic and make sure that we had what we needed, and also made sure that those adjustments we had made as a county government in the way we deliver business, to the extent that they could be carried through and relied on for efficiencies and savings, be carried on and relied on for efficiency and savings. So you'll see here, this is just a very small list of some of the changes that we have made during the pandemic over the last 11 months that have allowed us to reap some savings. You'll see the first item there is we're one of the first in the country, along with Alexandria, to do some remote call taking and dispatching in our emergency communications center. And we also, that we have our permit applications, almost all of them now can be submitted and paid for online. We've done virtual inspections, telehealth, behavioral health care, customer service, a whole series of things that aren't even on this list. For example, we have library book bundles. We have spent a lot of time figuring out how to do our commission meetings perhaps better with more participation through remote video participation like we're doing today. So before I dive into all the details, let me just emphasize again how all the pieces were put together. We had higher than anticipated real estate assessments. We had started in November when we briefed the community, assuming we were going to have close to a $50 million gap between revenues and expenses. Now that number is essentially cut in half to a $26 million gap between revenues and expenses. And here's the reasons why one of the reasons why it was cut was that higher than anticipated real estate assessments. To close that $26 million gap, we're relying on the next three bullets: cuts and efficiencies, operational changes, as I just highlighted, and one-time funding. So we'll now go into some of the details. We're going to have a couple of months to go into this in greater detail. First off, cuts, $16.4 million in departmental reductions. It's very important for us to note that we are not eliminating any positions currently filled by county staff. Given the hiring freeze that we've had in place for 11 months, now people should understand that hiring freeze means we haven't stopped our hiring completely, but we've been very, very tough about filling slots. For example, if we've had vacancies in public health, we have filled them. If we've had vacancies in planning, we have not. So those 56 FTEs, and in addition, we had an early out incentive program that between 40 and 50 county employees took advantage of, which built capacity to make sure that we would not have to lay off any county staff. So you'll see there the 56 FTEs proposing to eliminate 10 positions from the police department. These are sworn officers position, 10 deputy sheriffs. And then you can see a few of the other positions listed there. Reducing temporary staff in parks, and also some of the positions in behavioral health. Those are due to, and probation counselors, those are due to lower demands. And then you can see in the fire department, we've changed a few positions from uniform to civilian and gained some savings that way. I'm intending to continue the ongoing hiring freeze. We have some other adjustments in the way we're going to be staffing our emergency communications center. Again, here's another example of a savings. The sheriff is now doing roll call virtually, and there's some savings there. The next item I wanted to talk a little bit about was the delayed reopening of the Cherrydale and Glen Carlin libraries. I have budgeted fully for all branch libraries to open on July 1st, with the exception of Glen Carlin and Cherrydale. I don't think that's actually going to happen, but again, flexibility and adjustment is the watchword. So it may be that given to staffing challenges and where we are as a community with the pandemic, that we may not open all the branches till later in the year, which might free up some funds to relook at the Cherrydale and Glen Carlin closures. But again, flexibility is the watchword. And then we have some fairly straightforward savings, lower fuel costs. We're not driving around as much. And we've deferred some contracts and some other kinds of things that we can do without. So there you go. Let me talk a little bit again, as I said, getting back to the pandemic and COVID, again, our priority. I've set aside $17.5 million in a contingent fund. These are one-time funds. It is my hope, and actually I am expecting that you will not need all of this money to do all of the things that I have included in these bullet items. But this year, we have been assisting people in the community with eviction prevention, additional food, and also the support of the business community. We've had to go out and purchase additional personal protective equipment for our staff. We've had to clean our facilities. We've had to find places for people to go who have been, for whatever reason, some of our homeless and those who were infected with the virus, needed a place to stay. We've had some temporary hotel arrangements. All series of costs that were this year pretty much picked up by the CARES funding from the federal government. And again, not relying on any federal funds, we've set up this contingent to deal with all the items I've listed there on that sheet. Okay. Now, here it's going to sound a little bit like, it's not like there isn't a pandemic, because there is a pandemic, but we have not lost sight of all the other priorities we have as a community. We have this year, we're going to continue our commitment to providing housing grants for those people who are at certain levels of the income scale. And I'm proposing close to a $2.5 million increase in housing grants. You can see the numbers there, up to about $12.7 million. And this year we're continuing what we started last year, which was to adjust those grants so that they keep pace with the increase in rents. This is a particularly good year to do that, given that rents are not increasing all that much, but it gives us an opportunity to further catch up. We have our commitment to permanent supportive housing ongoing and housing choice vouchers. I won't go through all the list of the items here, but people should realize that there are essentially two buckets of what we're doing for housing. One is the here and now. Let's help people who need assistance to stay where they are. That's the eviction prevention I talked about earlier. And it's also the housing grants. And then we have, I'll call it the long game, which is let's have funds for additional committed affordable units and make sure that those funds we have are also being invested in maintaining that growing stock of committed affordable units. In that area, we have AHIF funding. We have the $20 million we received as a community benefit payment from Amazon for the Metropolitan Park development. And we also have something I'm very excited to be bringing to the equation for the first time. We have land. So we have, the county now has possession of property at Crystal Houses 5. We're in conversations with the Washington Housing Conservancy about getting additional property. The single most expensive and difficult part of any affordable housing project is getting the land. So we're very excited that we have that. And we will see where things go. You know, it may be that the county board will want to rely on the COVID contingent, if it's not fully needed, to provide additional resources here or elsewhere. And you can see that close to 4.6% of our budget does go to housing. And that's part of our safety net services, which are about 15% of our budget. Okay, county workforce. So I'm just going to start off, it's not here on the slide, but I want to thank the residents of the community who have gone out of their way to give shout outs to county staff. It's been, for many of us, it's been 11 months without a day off. We've been working incredibly hard. And, you know, the dedication of county staff has been really breathtaking. And, you know, last year, reluctantly, we did not include pay raises as part of my proposed budget, and the board adopted a budget without across-the-board pay raises. Again, this year, I'm proposing a budget without across-the-board pay raises. I am proposing a one-time $500 bonus for employees, and I am asking the board, to the extent that we do receive additional funding as part of the American Recovery Plan that I talked about earlier, that the board say that the first priority of those dollars would be to pay additional compensation to our staff. So you'll see also that, given that there are not across-the-board pay increases, I've made a special effort to focus some limited amount of dollars on some improvements. There's a long list here. I will not read through all of them. I did want to emphasize two of them. One is we're going to increase our lowest base pay rate from $15 to $17. That would apply to all county staff. It also would apply to contractors who are covered by our living wage ordinance. So we have provided budget for that. And in addition, the next to last bullet under that list shows the Live Where You Work program budget. we're going to substantially increase the amount of benefit for county employees, but we're going to tie it to the income of those employees. So the lower income that you have, the more of a benefit you would get. We're trying to see, we're acknowledging that it is hard for people to purchase property in Arlington and try to make it more attractive, and also provide additional rental assistance to employees at the lower end of the wage scale. We continue what we do every year, which is evaluate our jobs to make sure they stay competitive. You can see the job categories we're looking there, and happy to say that what is a surprise, but nevertheless present, that we are not proposing any premium increases for county employees for health insurance. So I want to catch my breath for a second, and I know that the county board adopted a resolution back in September of 2019, and it's been about a year and a half as we've gone through this journey to discuss racial equity. And I appointed Samia Bird, one of the deputy county managers, as the chief race and equity officer. And it's not just her job alone, it's the job of everybody in this organization and this community to focus on some of these tough questions about race and equity. And, having these conversations is very difficult. Samia has been working flat out since July. I committed to providing her additional assistance, and she is going to get an additional position in my office to work on that. We have a considerable sum of money set aside for training and to continue our dialogues on race and equity. In addition, and I know the board accepted a final restorative justice action plan. I've set aside some funds to continue with that effort. And then also an effort that will take many years, by many I mean at least 2 or 3 or 4 years, to provide an additional stipend and funding to our public defender offices. Our public defenders are not county employees, but what they do is they go into court defending the least fortunate among us, and it can become a real challenge to recruit attorneys to do that, and they are in court with Commonwealth's attorney. And I think that at some point there should be pay parity between those two groups of lawyers. So we're starting further along that journey. We've done a few investments over the last few years, and I think that's really important. Now, on the police practices group, on Monday night, I was able to spend a couple of hours with that group of 15 individuals, which I appointed back in July, and they provided their report to me. It runs between 90 and 100 pages, and I recommend it to anybody who wants to read what I think is an excellent body of work on the part of our residents to look at some of the challenges in 4 areas. So the money that I've laid out here, which comes close to $1.5 million, these suggestions need further conversation with the community and with the board, but let me cover them in sort of broad strokes. The first area, there were 4 groups. The first area looked at a potential civilian review board. I will be back to you with some recommendations as to how I think that board should be formed, but I do know that there's need at least for one position, whether that's an auditor position or an assistant position for the board, so I've set aside funds for that. The second bullet, and I'm really very excited about this, which is a co-responder model, starting to move us. It's going to take a while, but you can see to have a mobile crisis van and a crisis intervention center and peer recovery specialist to move away from a situation right now where police are the ones who respond to mental health crises. And this package that's been put together is a collaborative effort among that was worked on very, very closely by Naomi Verdugo and David Fitzgerald, who are on the subcommittee, along with our human services and our police and fire. And it's modeled after other co-responder models in the United States. So I've set aside some funds for that. Third area is to take a look at how we do our call processing in the Emergency Communication Center, and also to have, and Mr. Dorsey talked about this a couple of times over the last few months, have that tough conversation with the community about, is it right every single time? For 20 years, we've been told, see something, say something. And then let's figure out whether that still applies in every single circumstance, and talk a little bit about some of the biases some of us have that lead us to pick up the phone and call 911 in almost every situation imaginable. And the flip side of that, of course, is we want people to call 911 when there's some real potential risk facing them. But a lot of tough conversations. We need to do some training of our call takers, who I think are fantastic, and also some conversations with the community. And then the last bullet is something you will all remember from the fiscal 21 budget, pre-pandemic. There was a lot of effort spent on the traffic subgroup in the PPG to focus on better practices for policing and traffic, more emphasis on automated enforcement, and also more emphasis on enforcement of some of our, I'll call them pedestrian, bicycle, sort of scooter traffic provisions. And so here I've set aside funding for 6 staff, 1 supervisor, and 5 staff. These are not armed, uniformed officers, but they're traffic control officers modeled after, there's 1 or 2 examples in the United States where I think this model has worked really well. And again, to try to address some of the issues raised by the PPG. So a lot packed in there. And I know I'm talking really fast. Got a couple of other slides to go, and then we'll see if we have questions. Wanted to move on to the next slide. I mentioned this in the beginning. We have voters approved close to $51 million in a bond referendum in November. And we have, given that, we're increasing our budget and our expenditures. You'll see some of the planned projects at the Reed Elementary School. We have, and I do want to thank our colleagues in schools, an excellent opportunity for collaboration. We're building a very large underground vault that will help us with a stormwater detention facility. And you can see a number of projects listed there. You know, it's been July 2019, seems like centuries ago, but over a year and a half ago, I committed to come back to you with a very detailed and extensive stormwater program. And I did say that it would cost us. And so here are the details of that. One thing which we will spend a lot of time, I think, getting into in the work session is I'm proposing an increase in the tax rate from 1.3 cents to 1.7 cents. But we are halfway along a journey. I really do think it's right to move away from a tax rate to pay for this program. Right now, this program is paid for by charging people based on the value of their property. A better way to do that is to move to a storm utility, which would charge people based on the amount of their impervious surface on their property. That's done in virtually every other jurisdiction in Northern Virginia and in the greater DC area. I know the board is very interested in that. We have probably 6 months to a year of conversations to work out the kinks in that. But I wanted people to know that this is really following through on what we've heard and the priority the board has laid out for that. So we're anticipating issuance of about 20 to 25 million of those bonds over the next year. And as you can see, there's an increased level of expenditure. Let's go on. This is sort of a bit of a wrap-up slide that talks about some of the other things that we haven't covered. Metro, our funding is fairly flat, which is good, but that's mainly enabled by the additional federal assistance we've received. For fire, I say thank God we're finally here, year number 4 on the Kelly Day. Mr. Kelly, wherever you are, thank you. We have been adding 10 additional positions each year for the last 4 years. This is the 4th year. This will allow us to move to a revised work week. And is long overdue to improve the work conditions of our fire department. I mentioned the traffic safety officers, also additional positions to support the body-worn camera program. Also very excited to say that we have plans to open the Longbridge Aquatics and Fitness Center in July. Sort of a soft opening and more of a substantial opening around Labor Day if the pandemic allows. This is at no net tax to the tax burden to the Arlington County taxpayers. Thanks to Boeing Corporation, who's provided us a generous donation for the facility operating costs. So thank you very much to them, and we're very excited. Also, Lubber Run, the community center has been completed. It's an amazing facility. I've been inside it. It's sitting there empty. So through a series of reallocations and a small additional amount of spending, I'm going to propose that we open that again on July 1st. And then some additional funding for elections. Now, before we go past this slide, I did want to emphasize, since I've spent a lot of time talking about additions to the budget, we cut $16.5 million, okay, and we used $13 million to fill a $26 million gap. So if you can do the math, 16 plus 13 equals 29. We found $29 million of ways to fill a $26 million gap. That left us $3 million to do all the things I've talked about on the last few slides. So those of you at home who are watching want to know, well, what does this mean for me? So here we have our tax and fee burden on the average household. Again, averages belie the differences that each individual may experience. The real estate tax bill on the average homeowner, given my proposal to keep the tax rate flat, the average bill is still going to go up because it's based on the value. And you can see that is on the first line there, essentially a close to a 5 to 6% increase in the tax bill associated with assessment value increase. The next line is the stormwater tax I talked about. That would go from $89 to $123. I wanted to emphasize that of that $34 increase, 29 of that is related to the rate increase. $5 is related to the increase in value in assessments. Personal property, the average personal property tax will go down. That's based on, and Richard will know this, I think it's like owning 1.86 cars. And given the drop in value, that is assumed savings there. You'll see another line here, which is the refuse fee, which remains flat. Given what I think is a happy coincidence, we've been able to pay off some of the costs of replacing our bins and some of the underlying capital costs that went into that, some of the purchases there. We are going to be able to, I'm proposing starting in September, that we start a food scraps program as part of our enhanced recycling efforts. More to come on that, but we can add that program and keep the refuse fee flat due to some savings. And then the rest of it, you see a slight increase in the water sewer service fee. Here's a comparison with our peers. Our nearby peers are, since they are much more reliant on residential real estate, are having a little bit easier time of doing some things, doing fewer cuts, and in many instances offering pay raises to their employees. But we will update this as we go through the budget conversation. So let's go to the next slide. Why are we here today? Other than the fact that we love talking to each other. There's a board meeting on Saturday. And by tradition, over the last 6 or 7 years, we've held this work session because at the board meeting on Saturday, the county board will have to advertise the tax rate and all the various fees that we have talked about. And as you're familiar, when it comes to advertising tax rates and fees, you can advertise at a rate and you'll not be able to go above that when you adopt. You can keep it at that rate, or you could go lower. So the main question before you is what number you want to advertise for a tax rate, especially on the real estate tax rate, which is the most significant, on Saturday. Again, I'm recommending no changes to the tax rates for real estate tax, for the personal property, for business, professional, and occupational license taxes, and the bid tax rates. I am recommending that increase from 1.3 to 1.7 cents on the stormwater tax. And there's a series of fee changes I'm proposing there, which include increase in the cigarette tax. I'm not going to go read through all of them, but all those reports that highlight all those fee proposals will be posted online, as will this presentation at the conclusion. So looking ahead, summarizing, we've built a budget that I'm comfortable with, but realizing that we only had a 1.4% growth in overall revenue. So we've had to make some cuts. We're relying on one-time revenue in a way which we normally never would in a budget, but the pandemic hopefully will be gone or sufficiently behind us so that the reliance on that one-time revenue, I think it's reasonable to hope that those kinds of consumption taxes like the hotel tax and the meals tax will come back sufficiently strong so that in fiscal 23 we will not have to have a bridge year, but we will be on the other side of the bridge. And so again, I feel like I followed the best I could your guidance to focus on the pandemic while keeping our eye on our other priorities, which are listed there. So last slide, I think. Yes, the schedule. You are here, February 20th. Today's February 18th. February 20th is when the board will take action on the budget. The school board is going to reveal, the superintendent's going to reveal his budget on the 25th, which is a week from today. And then we have budget work sessions. We'll have an update for you sometime next month on how we're doing this current year to see if there's any money that might be available to help ease your decisions for fiscal 22. We have public hearings advertised for the first part of April and a potential budget adoption on April 17th. So I apologize for going on and on and on. It took me 35 minutes, and I know there was a lot packed in there. I'm going to turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz, for your giving us all that information and working through it quickly. I'm getting a little feedback, so I'll just check here. Colleagues, I don't know. I'll open the floor to questions to you, and we can do a round. And keeping in mind, this is a work session, and we'll take this up again on Saturday. But Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Schwartz. As it relates to your desire to have this board identify employee compensation as sort of the top line priority, if we realize federal aid to local governments of the magnitude that is possible, I presume that would come in the form of a one-time increase like the bonuses that you're proposing in the budget, since that is a one-time funding stream? You're muted, Mr. Manager.
Oh, good. I can change my answer then. Now, I'm considering at the time in March if we get that additional funding, it is my hope that I would be able to come to you with a permanent ongoing addition to the budget. Now, that is based on an assumption I am making that, and I finished my presentation, that I feel like I'm confident enough that there will be a bounce back in some of those ongoing sources of revenue, for example, the hotel tax and the meals tax. But we'll have to make that evaluation at that time. Our sister jurisdictions, Alexandria and Prince William and Loudoun, are offering ongoing compensation increases. So to be determined, but again, I wanted to signal to the workforce, it's my hope that they would be ongoing, but we'll have to have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. And in this case, just to make sure I understand and our community understands, another jurisdiction who in better economic times, the split between commercial and real estate assessments is very much the benefit of Arlington County, having a significant weight of that being the commercial sector, particularly if it's high performing. In this case, where you've got a low performing commercial sector and a high performing residential sector in terms of value, are the weight of the commercial sector in Arlington disadvantages us as it relates to general revenue compared to other jurisdictions that have mostly residential properties as part of their tax base. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. I think that I'm not exactly sure what Fairfax County is going to do, but I do know that I mentioned Prince William and Loudoun have the benefit of having a larger percentage of their real estate focused on residential. And then again, Loudoun has that just special category of data centers that, as I like to joke with my colleagues there, don't have kids that use schools, but seem to grow all the time in value. So yeah, that's a real challenge. And, you know, our commercial assessments overall were down 1.5%. And, you know, I remain a little bit concerned about what the future will look like there. But I will tell you this, which is that we'll have Metropolitan Park from Amazon coming online. We have Amazon continuing to invest, and they've submitted a site plan for Penn Place. That, I think, is going to help us a lot through what will be an additional trough in the commercial sector.
Thank you. You're muted, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Ms. Crystal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you as well for the presentation. I wanted to ask the contingent that you've laid out for COVID expenditures, the $17.5 million. You highlighted a couple of the bullets that might fall under that in the expenditure categories. Can you point us towards where we could find more about, you know, what each of those categories might look like? I think, for example, there is a lot of interest from me as a board member, and I suspect from the community, about what further relief could look like for the business, small businesses, et cetera. Will we kind of encounter those ideas or proposals as we move through conversations with the departments? Or do you have, you know, I know sometimes you'll include an addendum in your budget that sort of speaks in greater detail about a given initiative. So could you tell us and the community where they can learn more about what those items will be?
So in sizing that contingent, we went back and looked at some maximum spend rates that we've been having for eviction prevention and food assistance. We also mimicked the amount of money, it's $2 million that we did for business assistance, and also relied on the rates of expenditures we had for PPE and the other kinds of costs. So there will be a write-up in the budget. It's going to be relatively brief, lays out the numbers in proportion. But I will say this, which is that I know it's wrong, okay? It is. And that there can be adjustments among that total. I'm hoping we do not need that total. I will tell you that literally over the last 2 or 3 weeks, the state has really stepped up with additional funding on eviction prevention, which means our expenditures have gone down. So again, I said this is modeled after, you know, a worst case scenario. So we have laid it out in relative proportion. I don't want everybody in the community to think that it's just all there. Let us know how you want to spend it. We have it in relative buckets, but again, it's not fully cooked because, as I said, circumstances will change.
Thank you.
Sure. Great. Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Carbon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Manager, for the report and for all of the leadership getting us to this point. One sort of small question on the schools. I saw the Connect Arlington. I mean, I know this year we have been supporting schools a lot with funding to make sure that all the students have access to the internet. I know that's still a work in progress. I think that is an additional significant expenditure from what we've done in the past, and that and this is a question, I assume we're envisioning continuing so that if at some point, you know, the pandemic's over, the kids are back in school, but they still need a good internet connection. I mean, I think everybody does this day and age, and that you see that as something that will be actually an ongoing support for schools that we will continue to provide.
Yes, so thanks for that question. We had, if you remember back at the beginning of the pandemic, which seems 1,000 years ago, set aside some money for the Comcast Essentials program, which didn't get fully subscribed to by school students. So we moved on to the next phase, which was building infrastructure, especially along the western end of Columbia Pike around Randolph Elementary and around Arlington Mill, to build a broader sort of, I would call it a Wi-Fi mesh network that, and I can't use, Jack tells me I can't say Wi-Fi blasters anymore, but that's what it is. We put a lot of Wi-Fi up there. And so that's actually in place now. And schools is going out and testing it. We've got some really great success based on that model for the CBRS approach that you heard from New Urbana. So we have that in place, and we're continuing to work on that. And we were able to get some broadband dollars from the state, and we're committed to working with schools and expanding that as needed as we go through the the school year. We need to do a little bit of testing to make sure it's working well, but if it does, we're committed to expanding that.
That's great. Thank you. And I like the term blasters. I kind of get that. But I'm not a techie. So thank you. I mean, I consider this a major, really an important sort of part of our equity work that we're doing and improving, access for people in the county. And if we're not going to be an equitable community if there's large swaths of the county or anybody actually that can't afford a good internet service. That's just absolutely crucial. To me, it's like water and electricity. I think it is to all of us. So thank you. And then one other point, I'm assuming listening to this that unlike maybe in the past, I'm suspecting almost every budget work session or close to is going to include an update on where we are now with state support, federal support, and all of this moving picture that we've got.
Yes, and I think it will. The state, if you're tracking what's going on down in Richmond, the governor just said that another set of fortuitous circumstances where revenue is higher than what it was that the state had assumed. The governor has talked about providing additional funding for school teachers and for schools. And I think that there's hope that perhaps we'll get a little bit of a break. I apologize for being, I'm slightly pessimistic that somehow there will be thousands and thousands of dollars or tens of cents raining on us from Richmond. I've grown to be a little bit less optimistic, but I have a lot of faith in our delegation. I'm sure they're working really hard to make sure we get our share. And I think as Mr. DeFerranti can relate to, this week when the governor was here, he understands it, but it never hurts to remind everybody down in Richmond when it comes to things like getting funds for vaccines or for, equity programs that, we have our needs here in Northern Virginia too. So that's important.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, maybe Richmond will finally see fit. I mean, I know there's more money for teachers, but I believe so far it's matching, which just makes it really difficult, a heavier lift for even other school districts more than us. But hopefully that'll come through. I have much more faith in the federal millions that I hope will come our way. So thank you very much. That does it for me. I think the great budget. Last year you had a 400-something page budget and you had to throw it out around March or so. This one I think might withstand the year, and it'll be more of a keeper. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. DeFerranti. Thank you to all who worked to get us here to this budget. I mean, this hasn't been a very easy year, and I understand very well what it means to have a bridge year between, a COVID uncertainty environment to something that is post-COVID, and we don't really know yet how it exactly will look. I get the problems that are, consistently linked to this. Now, I have two questions. One is about the housing priority. I mean, in general, the housing priority is AHEF. The AHEF allocation is proposed to be flat. And I see and I appreciate the increase in housing grants and this immediate relief that we are providing, as it is really necessary. I particularly applaud the approach of adjusting the maximum allowable eligible rent, as I expect that it will include more Arlingtonians and make more Arlingtonians eligible, and therefore will have less displacement. But for AHEF, how does the number of AHEF, the $8.9 million, rhyme with the pipeline of potential projects next year? What, or asked in a different way, are we going to have to give up on something that may be coming up in next year, or is that an appropriate number to serve the current pipeline of projects with reasonable expectations?
So thanks for asking that. It gives me an opportunity to focus. There's two major potential expenditures for our AHIP funds. We have sufficient balances to, if we need to purchase the southern part of the Park Shirlington site. Mm-hmm. We also have been working, and I'd say it's a miracle that we've gotten this far, and we're finally on the road to success when it comes to Ballston Station, Clarendon United Methodist Church. We have enough funding set aside for that. The one thing that might suffer a little bit is we try to do a notice of funding availability where we seek some new ideas from the community. That's a little bit in the balance. And one other thing that I'm proposing that I'm asking you to act on Saturday is to extend the moratorium that you adopted in May of last year through all of calendar 21 to put a pause on some of the required AHIF repayments. So that is a good thing because it keeps people in their units and doesn't mean that they have to stress on it. But it also slows down some of the repayments to AHIF. We'll still be getting some AHIF repayments, but it slows it down. So, that's a long-winded answer of saying anything that's on the horizon that is at all a plan, we have it covered. Anything beyond that is a question mark at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Swartz.
Great, thank you, Mr. Karantonis. I just had one question for you, Mr. Manager, and that's, you spoke a little bit about the 13 million and the 16 million adding to 29, and you spoke some about the one-time funding, that it's an exception to the rule this year. Usually one-time funding, we just do not use that as a budget piece. And you mentioned, and I really do believe that we have structural economic growth possible over time, in part because of partnership with Amazon. But can you say anything more about the one-time funding that you've sought to use this year to help address this gap?
Yes, so there's a few pieces of that. One piece is, and I will be talking about this over the next few weeks or months, renegotiating some long-term leases that the county has on some property where we're able to restructure them to get some one-time payments up front, and that will be something I'll be covering with you this coming week or so, and we'll have a little bit of an announcement on that. So that is a fairly significant one-time payment. In addition, we had some one-time funds that we realized from the Holiday Inn project in Roslyn, which remained unallocated, and we've set those aside. And then we're also dipping into our economic contingent, which is essentially set up for rainy days or perhaps sleety days or whatever it is that we're in right now. And we have drawn on that. I'm drawing on that as a little bit of a stopgap, and consistent with the financial policies that we have, and then also some other small sources. So, I consider every one of these legitimate one-time, sources. I also, it's very hard for me because I've done about 30 budgets in my life. This is the first one where I've ever relied on one-time money to pay for ongoing work. It makes me anxious. I wouldn't do it if I didn't think that we weren't going to be on the other side of the pandemic sometime this calendar year. Because if we weren't, then it wouldn't be appropriate. If we, for some reason, are not on the other side of the pandemic, this time next year, I'll be coming back to you with some pretty tough cuts. But I don't want to do what we call yo-yo budgeting, where you do cuts and then you say, oops, we just add them back. It's okay, it's accepted to try to smooth the path to a certain extent.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We've had an ongoing dialogue since I've joined the board about your aversion to one time. So I know that you feel that deeply. And I also think fiscal restraint is essential. It is, your description of the yo-yo is budgeting that you want to avoid is really helpful in this case. And so I appreciate you just describing that a little bit. Mr. Dorsey.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. So Mr. Schwartz, I really appreciate your general fiscal caution and do agree, though, given that we do expect that any degree of reopening will definitely increase the number of consumption taxes that we receive. I think your approach is well grounded in reality for this year. But with that, I so appreciate that you're delivering to us a balanced budget and an opportunity to use any federal funds if realized for specific purposes. The reality is, and I'm not doing this to cast criticism, but from what I understand, we're likely to receive from the schools a budget that is not in balance, that requires increased funds in order to meet their primary objectives. And so it really just goes to underscore how critical the aid to local governments is for both the county and the school side. So I want to just hopefully get your perspective on what we are doing as a local government, maybe working in concert with our regional partners to make the best case to an already welcome Congressman Beyer. But are we making sure we're doing everything that we can to get this to the finish line?
Yeah, so I appreciate the way you described that, and I've been working with my colleagues in the region, and I know members of the board have worked with the other elected officials in Northern Virginia. And Congressman Beyer, I've heard him say he gets it. And there is absolutely, there's no shame in saying, federal government, we need to get through this in a way that honors the values of our community, which is to make sure that all of our programs get funded at a level consistent with what are real needs in the community. And I think that, we have tightened our belt and we will tighten our belt. And I think the additional resources from the federal government are not for nice to do things. They're for things that, essentially we need to continue as a government, whether that's compensating our employees, providing for additional students in our schools, whether it's to, make sure that we have, I didn't spend much time at all talking about our capital program. We've had to redirect significant dollars from our pay-as-you-go capital budget to basically go to a fix and break approach rather than trying to make sure that we're, in a better condition. So I make no apologies for saying we welcome the federal dollars and they're all needed, and I think we should stay focused on that. So I'll stop there.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Ms. Garvey.
Thank you. I'll just follow on this discussion a little bit, and I know everybody here knows it, but in case people are sort of listening, the point is that we need to correct me if I'm wrong. We want to get to the other side with our community intact, people in their homes and not a lot of homeless people. We want to make sure that our businesses are surviving as much as we can so that as the economy comes back, we're there and ready and we can grow. Because if we tighten down, it will be so much harder to start back again and so much more painful. So I think these are wise decisions you're making, Mark. I know it's hard to do something differently than you've done in 30 years, but these are extraordinary times. And I think it's absolutely the right way to go so that we don't harm ourselves in trying to save ourselves, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. Mr. Karantonis.
I completely align with Mr. Garvey, Mr. Dorsey, and I appreciate the effort here and the reluctant involvement of one-time funds. I have to say that I feel queasy myself. Even a federal support is a sort of one-time funding, which basically solves the problem today. We have it. But it puts us also in a different budgetary position in the next period, right? So that we need to understand. And we have to be very clear with our Arlingtonians about that. We try to keep it as frugal and as low as possible. The manager is proposing not to increase the tax rate, but we are banking not 100%, but we are expecting certain appropriations to come and to help us, essentially. You mentioned 20.5 million for IPS, approximately, and 46.34 million for Arlington, for Arlington County. I had a different question on the priorities list. Where will we see the environmental issues, like, for example, we have been talking about tree preservation, canopy preservation, park land acquisition, all these. Is that part of the weeds of the more detailed budget, or is that a kind of priority that we will see, percolating up in our discussions in the next 2 months.
So in our budget, we continue our commitment. We're moving slowly but steadily towards electrifying our fleet. So that is the thing when we get to the conversation about our auto fund. I would say that when it comes to parkland acquisition, traditionally, that is one of the places where if we had more funds, you would see that in our pay-as-you-go budget, or also as part of the upcoming conversations on our CIP. I think there's a lot more that I would like to do in that area. And again, I think that I don't want to keep going back to this, but the federal government and the president's package, the $1.9 trillion package, talks about investments in green infrastructure, which I think will be really important, and they will benefit us in ways that I can't quantify for you. I was talking about the direct financial assistance in that package, but I can't say that I'm particularly thrilled with what our budget does when it comes to the environment, because it's not because I feel like we're being derelict. I just feel like there's so much more to do. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz and Mr. Karantonis, for the question. I just want to finish, unless others have any concluding comments, with a couple of thoughts. First, as far as fiscal restraint and discipline, the 56 frozen positions is, I think, a really good example of that. And I am thrilled. If we think back to 3-5 months ago, we wanted to ensure that that we wouldn't have layoffs of people currently in positions. And so that part of the proposal is so helpful. I'm mindful that employees are listening and may be listening. And I am certainly Senator Kaine, as well as Senator Warner, in addition to Congressman Beyer, support the federal investment. And the first thing we need to do, if that moves forward, is see what more we could do for employees. The budget seems to be equity focused. It's working on those most in need, which I know all of us share. And then it provides for the pandemic, which is where we started this conversation. And that has to be our focus. And vaccine distribution, I'm really glad, Mr. Manager, you mentioned the wise decision to cancel today and get Saturday and Sunday started. So those are just a few kind of concluding thoughts. Unless others have additions, this is the start of the process. That last slide that Mr. Schwartz, that you described on Saturday, we will set a top available tax rate. And then from there, we will have a series of work sessions that will go in detail into the budget. So this is the initial part of the budget process. Thanks for going through 35 minutes there, Mr. Schwartz. Thanks, colleagues, for the questions. Unless there's objection, we will go ahead and adjourn for the day with a handy gavel that I'm so getting used to using respectfully. We're adjourned. Thanks so much, colleagues and Mr. Manager.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everybody.
Yeah. Get used to the gavel.